All right. Welcome back to week four's Q&A video for the SAS Bootcamp. So this week's content was challenging for certain, and I've received that feedback from a few of you already, and I'm completely aware of that. So it's great that you've been watching these videos so far. This week is a little challenging, but I promise you all that starting next week, things will get so much more easy. In fact, let me do this because over the past few days, I have not received any questions at all about content in this week's videos. I have received 3 or 4 people asking me questions about the homework itself. So we'll talk about those when we discuss the homework. But instead of talking about questions about the content, which I will open up for if one of you on the call here has questions, I want to give a little bit of an insight as to what's coming next, right? So this is 4 weeks into SAS Bootcamp right now. If you've stayed with us this far, if you've been watching the videos, if you've been doing the homework every week, I will say that by the end of this week, you should know enough information to do a simple project in health outcomes research using Medicare and Medicaid claims data at the Department of Pharmacy Administration. If you already know enough information to do that, you are ready to get started. The one thing I have not shown, which you might need if you were to work on that project, is some simple statistics. I have not shown anything about how to calculate a mean, a percentage, how to do a regression, any of those things. Right? There are no statistics whatsoever have been covered so far, but those things will come in week 6. So just hold on. All of that is coming as well. Despite knowing all of the information that you already know, I don't think you know enough to go get a SAS-based certification. So if you want to pursue getting a base certification with SAS, which involves an exam and some of these things that SAS offers officially, you might have to learn a few more things. Not all of those things that you will need for a base certification are actually going to be necessary to do a health outcomes research project. I'm sure they're all good to have, but they're not quite necessary. But everything that you've learned so far should be enough. What we are going to learn next week is we are actually going to switch gears pretty quickly next week. So far we've been learning how to manipulate data sets, how to build, how to add columns, how to add rows, merging, all of these things, right? And we've looked into it through data steps. Next week, we are going to relearn all of these steps once again, but without using data steps. We are going to learn how to do all of the things we've done so far in the past 4 weeks using something called proc-SQL. And proc-SQL is one of those things that my understanding is that you don't need to know proc-SQL for base SAS certification. Kaustav, if you know if that is correct, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't think you need that for SAS certification, correct?
Yes, you need it for the advanced SAS certification, not for base SAS.
Okay, so you don't need that for the base SAS certification, but I like to teach proc-SQL because I have found that some of the things that we've learned the hard way actually get a lot more simple once you use proc-SQL. So we will talk about how to use proc-SQL to do some of the same things that we've done so far. I did not want to start teaching them with proc-SQL because it is helpful to see how it is done with a regular data step, practice it, learn it that way, and then recognize that there is a shortcut to do things. And there is a different way to do things as well. And we'll talk more about that next week. But starting next week, things will get really easy because next week we are just revisiting all the old content using a new method, proc-SQL. And the week after that, we are going to learn how to create a simple descriptive table for your manuscript if you're working on a paper, how to do means, percentages, and we are going to also learn how to do macros. That's the last material topic, if you will. That's the last content topic that we will learn in week 6. And that's it. And after that, we will have 1 more week of the bootcamp left, but the only thing we'll be doing that week is talking about our class project. So hopefully, while you guys have been watching videos for each week, you have also seen this week I uploaded a video describing the class project. And as I explained in that video, that was a very real project at one time before I stopped working on it. And it's a very real data set collected using publicly available data in the United States. So go ahead and watch that video. That project is also challenging. I am not going to tell you that it is easy to do. You will have to spend a good bit of time to figure out how to make those things work. But every single thing you need to do on that project is content we've already covered in the bootcamp. you don't have to go look up anything on Google or in the little SAS book or anywhere else to complete that project. Everything you need for the project should be in the videos. It's just that you may have to apply them perhaps creatively or with a twist on it. But you should be able to do it just based on the knowledge shared through these videos so far. Having said that, I'm going to pause for a second because I want to see if anybody here has questions about the content from this week's videos. And once we cover that, we can then switch to the homework for this week. So any questions from the people on the call? Okay. I haven't seen anything. We only learned
I actually have a question. I'm sorry, I was unmuting.
Okay.
So I wasn't able to successfully execute one of the do loops that you did.
Okay.
And it was the arrays, it was under arrays. And when you did last day, first day to last day, and you were counting continuous days of eligibility, the one that you showed, like if last day is greater than 90, and like when I use the greater than, less than, equal to, that worked. But you showed an alternative way. Do I equals first day to last day, and pass I equals 1. And then it should, you made it run, but I couldn't make it run because last day exceeded 90. The first day could be between 1 and 90, but last day could be 120. So my code didn't run.
Okay, that is a very good point, and we did not talk about that too much during the videos. Is this the code you are referring to, Dr.
Yes,
Chang? That's
exactly,
the stuff that I've highlighted, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing to remember when using arrays with a do loop and that counter variable that increments for every loop is that if the value of your counter variable ever exceeds the number of variables in your array, you will have an error. What do I mean by that? So this array statement has 90 variables, right? Day 1 through day 90. So if your counter variable ever in your do loop ever goes beyond 90, if it goes up to 100 or even 91, then it will throw an error because it will show you a message that says array subscript out of range. The array subscript out of range means this POSS I, that I value was greater than the number of variables in the POSS array. Right? And when that happens, SAS cannot run. So if you want to use this particular do loop here, the only way to do it is to make sure that there are no last day values that are greater than 90 in your data set. So this piece of code here, this if then statement, which says if last day is greater than 90, then set it to 90. You have to run this before this can work. Was this your experience as well, Dr. Chang?
I see. Yes. Yeah. I guess I didn't run that. Yeah. If statement. Okay.
So this if then statement is not necessary to run this do loop for a couple of reasons, right? Because no matter what the actual last day is, this do loop will stop at 90 days.
Right.
So if somebody's prescription goes beyond the 90th day, we just ignore it because of the fact that this counter variable runs only up to 90. But when we are doing this do loop, we run up to the very last day, no matter what day that is. So we have to stop it at 90 before that will execute.
Exactly. Yeah, I kind of omitted that. Yeah, that if statement.
So this is basically this step, this if then statement is best coding practice, no matter whether we use a do loop that looks like this or like this, right? So if we do this if then statement, we won't have issues no matter which option we use. But if we don't do it, this will throw us errors.
Right.
But that's a very good question. One other time where I've had the array subscript out of range error is often when I'm running these do loops and I sometimes don't correctly count how many variables I have in my array. I might be off by 1 or 2 days sometimes, and I will get that array subscript out of range comment. So whenever you see that, that just means that your counter variable in your do loop is not running correctly.
Right.
Okay, I hope that helps. Any other questions? Okay. I see Shishir has joined us as well. Shishir, just to catch you up, you haven't missed much.
Yes, sir.
You haven't missed much. I'm just walking through the videos so far. If you have any questions on the content, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to start jumping into the homework for this week.
Well, I got stuck in step 5.
Okay.
Well, the concepts were clear, but I could not convert the concepts in the coding. That's
Yeah.
exactly. I think I missed some codings, so could not exactly uh,
I
write the
understand.
concept inside. Yeah.
I will tell you that merely from my text exchanges and from Twitter, you are not the only person to struggle with that. It is one thing to learn how arrays work. It is one thing to learn how you can incorporate do loops and arrays together. Applying that for the problem on hand, it takes some practice. It's not something that will come to you on the first day, right? So it's okay if you're struggling with that. For any of you that have struggled with step 5 and step 6, which I think are probably the most challenging steps in that homework, it's okay if you struggle. We can talk about how this will work when we do the homework, and hopefully as you get to practice more, these things will become a little more easier. I will tell you that every once in a while I still get stumped. There will be uh, something I need to complete for a project where I will go, okay, I need to think about how to approach this problem, and the logic sometimes gets a little complicated, and that programming logic is something that you will get better at as you do more projects. That's just how it works. You just need a lot
Yeah.
of experience.
I just had to I also had to have a question. So adding to what
Okay.
Shishir said, I did this, I was confused and had troubles on specifically on that part. But I'm just curious if there is any other way to do like first dot variable instead of first dot variable and last dot variable. Is there anything else we can do? Because for me that's very challenging. It's still, I don't know what I doing wrong, but it's just
Very good question again. So the first dot and last dot variables are one thing that I think even I struggle with the most. Everything in SAS that I'm teaching in this bootcamp, that's probably the most challenging aspect to grasp even for me. But I will recommend that you persist with it at least a little bit and you try to learn those fundamentals. Next week, though, we will see an alternate way to do that. So remember, when we talked first dot and last dot variables, we talked about defining these buckets within which you can do mathematical operations like averages and sums and stuff. There are other ways to define buckets without using first dot and last dot variables, and those alternate ways are actually really, really simple. They are so much more simpler, in fact, that as part of a normal project, I don't use first dot and last dot variables, I would say 90% of the time. There are some occasional cases where I will have to use it and there is no alternative, and that comes down to that specific project's objectives or what I need to do on that data set. But about 90% of the time, I don't use first and last dot variables to define my buckets. I instead use proc_SQL. And we'll talk about proc_SQL next week. So if you're struggling with it, I would recommend that you continue to work through it, continue to use examples and rewatch those videos. But there is an alternative coming, so don't panic if you don't get it.
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that next week. That's in fact, proc_SQL is the only topic we are covering next week. There is nothing else we are going to talk about.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. But hopefully when I work through this homework, that will also help you understand how first dot and last dot variables work. Okay. Having said that, I think it is time to get into the homework. Are there any other questions I need to answer before we start? Okay. Haven't seen any. All right. I executed my libname statement. Let me check that all my data sets are here. And then we can get started. Patient info data set is here, RX claims is here. Okay, so in this week's homework, the objective of the work was to be, the homework was basically to identify the percentage of days that somebody took their medication without any gaps in medication fills, but only to calculate that percentage for all the people that are continuously eligible and for individuals that are adults, which means they are over 18 years of age. And the continuous eligibility requirement only refers to 7 months of data for which I have provided eligibility within this data set, right? So we need to first identify. Okay, let me go through this step by step because the homework does it that way as well as I've described it. The first step is to use the patient info file and delete those individuals that are not adults. Let me see if I can get started on that. The first thing we want to do is I want to say, excuse me. Okay. We need to calculate an age before we can identify if somebody is over 18 or not. And you identify the age variable using the date of birth column right here. So let me use the YRDIF function. Hopefully you've seen how this works and you know how this will work. I can calculate the age on any specific date, but one other thing I can do is I can just calculate age based on today's date, right? So if I want to do that, I just say today. My second variable can just be today's date, so that whenever you run the code, it automatically gets updated to check their age on the day that the code is being run. And I want to say actual. I can spell actual correctly, okay? And then I want to say if age is less than 18, then delete those individuals. Let me run this. Code looks okay. And we did not delete anybody. In fact, we went from 18 observations in the original file to 18 observations in this file because everyone in our data set is already an adult. Yeah, nobody's even close to 18 except this one person here. I think this person was less than 18 when I first created this data set for the class 2 years ago, but since then I have not updated the date of births. So right now nobody is over 18 in this data set, but that's okay. This is one of those things where we have to check the age and we have to do it. And if nobody's deleted from the data set, that's fine. We still know that our data set is now adults only. Another way to do this, if you don't want to use this option, is to basically, instead of writing this age variable, you can just paste the whole thing in here. And that should do the same exact thing. Because what we are doing here is I'm taking this whole function, which calculates the age, and incorporating it within my if condition statement, right? The advantage of doing it this way is that you won't have another column when you finish, and your data set won't have an additional column that you might not need. But if you do need that column, then you should use this option. I'm trying to show these variants because really, there are so many ways to do this homework and any other thing that you're trying to accomplish in SAS, and it's not possible for me to display every single option. There are probably 300 ways to do this week's homework, right? I'm going to show 1 or 2 ways every scenario wherever possible. You might have calculated age using a different function. You might have used a different if-then statement to delete these individuals. You might have used an output statement with the greater than or equals to option, right? So there are a lot of ways to do this. I'm just showing a couple of ways you can use to try and be efficient with your code. Okay, so that should delete individuals that are not adults in your data set. But that's not the only requirement for the eligibility criteria. In fact, the second criteria is that they need to be continuously eligible for all 7 months that we have in the data set. You can do this a couple different ways. Number one, if they need to be eligible for all 7 months, here's my data set. You can make sure you can define an array you can make sure individuals have 1 in every single column as the array has a do loop that goes from the first month to the 7th month. You can do that. But continuously eligible for 7 months also just means that if you add up all 7 variables, you should get the number 7. So you can use a simple sum statement, or you can just add the numbers up. Let me do this. Let's say eligibility equals, I'm going to use a sum statement here, just because I know Dr. Young was struggling with that earlier today. And that actually reminds me that I needed to mention one more thing. I've had 3 people this week, I think, reach out to me saying they were struggling for the last 30 minutes or 45 minutes over a simple error, but they did not feel comfortable enough to reach out to me. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you're spending 30 minutes, 45 minutes on one simple error statement because you can't make something work, just send me a picture. Send it on Twitter. You can send it to me over email if you want, if that's what you're more comfortable with, or text. I've been working in SAS long enough that sometimes I can look at a piece of code and immediately identify what is going on without spending much of my time at all. So I would rather you ask me your questions without worrying that you might look like you don't know what you're doing, instead of you trying to spend 45 minutes trying to understand why a simple line of code is not working, right? So that's just a general comment. I meant to mention that at the beginning of the video today and I forgot. Okay, so I use a simple sum statement here. You could have done an array if you wanted, but I'm not going to show that. I think this is simple enough that I'm only going to show one way to do this. Here's my output. Oh, that didn't work. The log looks okay.
I think if you make it sum off when you have multiple variables specified.
Thank you. Good point. So I need to do this, right? There you go. I got lazy with my coding.
Sum of elig 2017-01-2-07.
Yeah, so I think this will work. So if you want to specify if you want to list out every variable you need in your sum statement, you can use this. But if you use the sum of function, you can do what I did earlier, where you don't have to list out every single one. You can just basically list the first one and the last one separated by a hyphen, like you would in an array definition statement. Is that right, Kaustav?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if this works. That's my log. Okay, there you go. So now we can say basically that as long as elig is equal to 7, individuals are continuously eligible. Those that have less than 7 need to be deleted. So less than 7, then delete. And this should give you your eligible population that you need to complete this homework. And I'm using the word eligible population on purpose here, right? When you are working, yeah, I think this worked fine. When you are working in large data sets or big data, particularly claims data sets, the first thing that you want to do is you want to always define who your population is. Set your population's eligibility criteria, whether that is age dependent, whether that is enrollment dependent, or maybe you're interested in a particular disease area, right? Maybe you only want patients with diabetes. The first thing you would do is you would set your eligible population just like we are doing right here. And then once you've defined that population and created a data set with all the individuals that you need, then you go on to find out the other information or the other variables you need to capture. So my goal with this homework was to replicate as closely as possible a typical simple project that you might be working on if you're doing health outcomes research. All right. Having said that,
Sujit, can you please go back to your output? I want to see which individuals were deleted.
Okay.
Till 60. Okay, yeah, okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure.
Is that what you were expecting, Queenie?
So, yeah, because I used continuous eligibility greater than 7 then output, and then I think I missed your output screen, and so I just wanted to confirm that.
I see.
Yeah.
So you have to, if you use greater than, you should use greater than or equals, not just greater than, right?
Yeah, greater than or equal 7 then output, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That would work just fine.
I have a really I think, dumb question. I did the greater than or equal to, but can you just do equal to, or does it have to be one or the other?
No, this should also work. So if you do equal 7, this should work. Now, I usually use greater than or equal to be more comprehensive, if you will. So in cases where we are working on a data set where we usually set minimum eligibility, not maximum eligibility or exact number of eligibility. So we might be following diabetes patients, and we might say, I'm only interested in patients if they're at least eligible for 6 months. So in those cases, if you are just using a sum function, there may be people eligible for 12 months, 15 months, 25 months. And if you use an equal to variable, equal to in your condition, you might not capture those individuals. So using greater than here basically is a way to make sure you cover everybody. But for our specific example in the homework, it doesn't matter. There is nobody with a number greater than 7. So you could have just used the equal symbol. It would be fine. Those are just, I think, good practices, if you will. If you're working on a data set with tens of thousands of rows or hundreds of thousands of rows and you can't check every single one, you just wanna make sure that everybody has a minimum eligibility set, then you can use a greater than or equal to. And honestly, in this homework, they are all the same. They don't make any difference whatsoever. Output looks fine. Log looks fine. Output is the same. There we go. We have 16 people now. Okay. So once we've done this, the next step is to, for each of the individuals that are eligible, we need to pull RX claims. How do we do this? Simplest way to do it is to merge the individuals in this data set with the RX claims data set. But you remember that before we do any merges, the first thing we need to do is sort our data set. So let me go ahead and do a sort first. Actually, you will observe that the data set that we have just created is already sorted by BennyID, but I'm going to write this back in any way just because it is good coding practice. And it is good coding practice to do this because if you are coming back to this project, let's say a few months later, and you change something in the code before that merge statement that throws off the sort, having that sort procedure will make sure you don't end up with an error. So I'm going to write the sort procedure even though it is already sorted by BennyID, just because it is good practice. I'll check my log, and I don't need to look at my data set because I know it's already sorted. I also want to sort my RX claims data set. In fact, that data set is also already sorted, but I'm going to sort it just as good coding practice. The other thing to notice here is that I can run this code right now, which is basically sorting the data set that's in the class library, but this will not work for most of you because I am the only person that has the editing privileges to the files in the class library. So if you want to be certain, just use the out option and write work.rxclaims. I didn't do that for the previous sort statement because this data set is already in the work library to begin with, right? So it didn't really feel like that was important. This code should run whether or not you have an out statement. This code may not run if you don't write an out statement because you cannot override files that are in the class library. Okay. And run this as well. Check my log. Okay. Then it is time to merge your data sets. I want to call this data set patient_rx. And I want to use my merge statement. I really do not like SAS Studio's pop-ups telling me what I should be typing. Go away. I know what I want to type. Okay. Merge by BennyID. When doing these kinds of merges, another area where you will commonly run into errors is that you would have checked your data sets before you did the merge to make sure that the key variable is in both data sets. But sometimes the key variable may be numeric in one data set and it may not be the same format in the second data set. So one can be a number, but one can also be formatted to be a character, right, like a string. So even if the same variable is in both data sets, it is important when you're doing the merge that the variables have the same format, not just the same value. Same name of the variable, same format, and same value. All three things are important when you do the merge. In our case, it's not a problem because we know that the Benny ID variable is numeric in both data sets. I gave the data sets to you that way. While doing this merge, I want to make sure I use a in statement because I want to have control over what type of merge I am doing. And on this topic, what I want to do here is I want to do a left merge, and I say I want to do a left merge because that's what I mentioned in my homework, right? But as you will see, using a left merge is probably not ideal. We'll talk about why, and Shishir mentioned this during the course of the week. So there were 16 observations in the eligible adults, which there were 16 people in there that were eligible, 82 observations in the RX claims data set, and my final data set has 80 observations. So not 16, not 82. Whenever these numbers don't align like that, I want to go to my output and make sure I have exactly what I'm looking for, right? So for example, we deleted individual number 2 because of their lack of eligibility. I want to make sure that my output data set does not have individual 2. And then it goes all the way up to 18, and it has captured for each individual every single prescription. So this looks good. Now, my data set has a little too many columns going on, and I actually don't need all of these columns. So let me come back here. I'm going to add a drop statement in the earlier statement, in the earlier piece of code, because I just, too many variables. I like keeping my data sets cleaner, if you will. Rerun that. Okay, now let's look at our output. So we have Benny ID, gender, race, date of birth. We don't even need date of birth, honestly. Eligible, fill date, day supply. Let me go ahead and remove date of birth. And I want to remove eligible. Once we know that somebody is eligible, there's no point holding on to that variable. Okay. I don't think that worked. Oh, because this is eligible spelled with an I, and I have a typo here. Typos are the bane of your existence in SAS because the code does not recognize typos, and it will run as if everything was okay until you check. Okay. Log looks okay. Okay, here's my output. So now I have multiple prescriptions for every single person in the data set, except you'll see here there are some missing values. So there is a missing value right here, but there is no day supply, no fill date. For individual number 4, that's male, we don't have anything, because if you go back and open the RX claims data set, you will see that individual 4 has no prescriptions at all. Individual 3 has all these prescriptions, and then individual 5 has all these prescriptions. Individual 4 never went to the pharmacy to pick up any medications. So when we run this code and pull all prescriptions for eligible individuals, we see that individual 4 basically has no prescriptions. So what do you do at this point, right? And Shishir asked this question on Twitter, and he made a very good point. He said we should be using an inner merge, not a left merge, because if you use an inner merge, individual 4 that's only in one data set but not the other will get automatically deleted. And I agree with that. I think that's definitely one way to approach this. But what you end up doing depends on the project you're working on. For this homework, I have not given any information. But if you're working on a project, you might want to hold on to individual 4, whether or not they have prescriptions, because if they don't have prescriptions, their percentage adherence that's calculated at step 8 maybe should just be 0. 0 because they don't have any prescriptions, right? So we need to make a decision for how you want to treat those individuals. In this particular example, for the purpose of this video, I'm actually not going to delete individual 4 or this individual 8 that also does not have any prescriptions. I'm just going to leave them in the data set as we do all the processing and we'll see that their percent adherence should be equal to 0 at the end because they don't have any prescriptions. But if you prefer to delete them, if your project requires that you delete them, you can delete them either in the next step now by saying if fill date is missing, delete them, or you can delete them by using an inner merge, which will make sure that individuals that are not in both datasets, they get deleted. Shishir, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. If you did an inner merge for this, it's acceptable. I don't think it is wrong. It's something that depends on the project itself. And for the purpose of this homework, I did not give you enough information on what to do with those individuals anyway. So I understand. Okay. Next thing we need to do is step 4, which says for each individual row, create and populate a possession array that includes 210 day variables. So let's go ahead and start that. Create a possession array. I'm going to call my data set POSS underscore RX. I'm going to set my PT underscore RX data set. We are using 210 day variables because we have 7 months for every single individual, and roughly assuming there are 30 days in every single month, we are interested in 210 days. So let me go ahead and create a 210 day array. I'm going to call it day 1 to day 210. You could have called this anything you wanted. Excuse me. I forgot to give my array a name. Okay, so my array is called POSS. It has 210 variables in it. Each variable is called day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, all the way up to 210. If I'm not certain if this will work, I can always run that little bit of code with nothing but that array definition statement and check my output to see if all the columns are there. And you'll see here on the left that we just created 210 columns with that one line of code between our set and array statements. Okay, but once we have this, the next thing we need to do is we need to say, let's go ahead and fill in that array based on when the prescription was filled. This exact example was shown during the video itself, so I'm hoping this was not difficult for you guys. So I'm going to skip through this part pretty quickly. Date minus 01 January 2017. Okay, so one thing I will say about these, this is the same as the ones we looked at in the previous videos. I'm not going to spend too much time, but this, these 3 or 4 lines of code which translate between the actual date in the data set and the array variables that we are interested in, or the array range that we are interested in, that translation is a very, very important piece of the puzzle. Often when doing these kinds of possession arrays, identifying how to do that translation is a lot more challenging than the examples that I'm showing you here, right? Because in our case, for those 210 days, we know exactly that we are interested in a 210-day period that begins January 1st and ends 210 days later. In most health outcomes research projects, you don't know that it begins on January 1st. Instead, the 210-day period may begin on the day they were diagnosed with diabetes, or it may begin on the day they had a surgery, or it may begin on the date of their first prescription, right? But no matter what situation you have, you need to identify when you're doing a possession array, what is the actual date when the array should begin, and how do I translate from that date to my array subscript language, which goes from 1 through 210, right? That translation may be a little tricky the first 2 or 3 times you work on a project where you're building possession arrays. But once you do it a few times and you understand conceptually why you are doing that translation and why you are subtracting from 1st January, hopefully it will get easier after that point. I'm going to use a very simple statement to do this. If I is greater than or equal first day, and I is less than or equal to last day, There was one unclosed do. I broke my own rules of writing the end statement as soon as I write my do statement. And then I forgot to do it. Now so that's threw me an error. Okay. Let's check our log. Log looks okay. Check our output. So I'm seeing these ones. Let's check. When was this? This prescription was filled 15 January. So that must be day 15 where the one started. Okay, there you go. So day 15, we have a 1, and we should have it for the next 30 days here. Yeah, the SAS Studio cuts you off at day 25, but yeah, that seems to work. And there are missing values everywhere else, except here for day 24. Let's see if this prescription was filled on 24th of January. And it was. So 24th of January, the prescription was filled, so the possession array changes to 1 from missing on day 24. If you don't like seeing those missing values, then I would just enter an else statement here. And I don't like seeing those missing values. Sometimes those missing values are okay. In fact, you know what? I'm going to leave them like that. You could have written that else statement to make them zeros, but you don't have to. You can just leave it exactly as it is, and that should also work just fine. Yeah, in fact, let me leave it as missing because that will help me demonstrate one other concept or one other property of missing values. I'm going to run this one more time. Make sure it's done. Okay, so that's step 4. Let me write step 4 here in my comment. Next, step 5. We need to roll data set up 1 row per individual.
Hey, Sujit, I had one question about that previous step.
Okay.
When so I checked at the end. I wanted to see what my first day and last day was, so I just kind of looked at those, and I found that some of my, I think it was some of my first days were like past 210 day or something like that, and so I wrote a line of code that basically said if that first day was greater than 210 days to get rid of those people there. Was that and did I do something wrong? Let's see.
No. So I see there's somebody here with 211.
Right. So I saw that, and it took me a little while to figure it out.
So actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing I always try to be careful about is cases like this, which are just 1 day beyond that. That means I'm not doing my math right here. So wait, let's find that 210 11 day. What was their date of prescription? Okay, so they got their prescription 30th July,
Right.
which is actually 7 months. But because we assumed that there were 30 days in every month, I think that date fell beyond the 210th day. So yeah, that person, we can go ahead and exclude them. So there are a couple ways to deal with it, right, Eric? So we can either say if your first day was greater than 210, we just want to delete that row, right? Or we can just not do anything about it, and it will not affect our results because our do loop is only going from 1 to 210, right? Because the do loop is going from 1 to 210, if I will never be greater than 210 for the person that filled their prescription on their first day, which was 211. Right? So their possession array will be missing for all 210 variables, and that's okay. Does that make sense? So I don't think I need to write any code to fix that.
I had something that looked weird about that. The reason I changed it. Go back and look at those people for that person for a second.
Okay. So this is 210. Their last day was artificially set to 210.
No, there was something else that must have messed up on. Okay. There was another issue I had earlier that I fixed when I did something, but.
Well, it's always possible that when you are scrolling through and looking at everyone, you might identify some scenarios or cases that I could have missed, right? When you write code, it should apply to every possible situation. It should apply to people that had their prescription on day 1, on day 210, and people that had prescriptions before day 1 and after day 210, right? It's possible that as I'm looking through this, I'm not identifying those scenarios, but you identified something like that my code does not properly account for. If there is something like that, we should catch it and we should fix it, but I don't see what it is right now.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I think it answered everything I needed to.
Okay, if you find something and if you think there is a scenario or a person that we are not accounting for with this code, then yeah, please let me know. I would want to fix that. Okay. Next, what we need to do is we need to roll the data set up. And this roll the data set up is the common programming language. So I'm used to speaking in those terms. What I mean when I say roll the data set up is I want to make sure that my data set only contains one row for each unique individual. In this data set right now, individual 1 has 5 rows in there, right? 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 is in there 5 times because they had 5 prescriptions filled during our study period. I don't want that. I only want 1 row per data set, and you have to bring them up and you have to roll them out because you have to roll them up to that 1 row, because if you want to compare to see if somebody had a prescription or not on each individual day, you can't do it if those information is on 5 different rows. If somebody has day 1 through day 2 filled here, day 3 and day 4 filled here, and then day 5, day 6 filled in the next row, unless you roll all of them up into 1 row, how can you compare if they had a prescription on every single day of your study period, right? So we cannot have multiple rows per individual. We have to bring them up to 1 row. So whenever I say roll data set up, or whenever I say you have to aggregate across or bring down the number of rows, you should be thinking that you need to read across rows, right? And in that reading across rows section, which we covered not this week, but the week before that, in week 3, you will see that we talked about using lag functions, retain functions, and first and last operator. In this particular example, we don't need the lag function. What we need is the retain function with the first and last operators. A few of you I know have struggled with it, and I say a few because it was not just one person. I know at least 2 or 3 people that have had trouble with step 5 and step 6 here. The way to do step 5 and step 6, really, there are many ways to do step 5 and step 6, especially with step 5 and step 6 as well. Actually, there are many ways to do this. I'm going to demonstrate one way to do it. And what I'm going to do as I do this is I'm going to help show you guys how I think as I approach these problems, because that's the best way I know of how to teach these things, right? There is no possible way that any bootcamp or SAS class you take will teach you every single scenario for every project you might ever work on. But instead, if I walk you through my thought process, I'm hoping that will be helpful and useful as you approach future problems that might involve your problem-solving approaches, especially for reading across rows. So let me tell you guys what I would do when I do this. The first thing, as soon as I realize I need to roll the data set up, is the first thing I say is, I might probably have to use first dot and last dot variable. So why don't I go ahead and sort my data set? The first thing I will do is sort my data set. And while I'm sorting my data set, I have to identify what I should be sorting by. And if I'm saying sorting by, I need to know what are my buckets. In this particular example, I need my bucket is the Benny ID, right? Because I need to have 1 row per Benny ID, and I need to bring up all the other variables in this data set to be summed across so that they'll only have 1. So the Benny ID is the bucket I'm interested in. So the only thing I'm going to sort my data set by is Benny ID. I could sort by other things if you want. I can sort by fill date, for example. But I don't need to, because the only bucket I'm interested in is Benny ID. So sorting by other things could not hurt, but is really not necessary. So let me first complete my sort procedure. Okay. My data set was actually already sorted, so I didn't have to do this. But again, this is just good practice. Next, what I want to do is I want to sum up all of my claims to 1 row. So I'm going to call my data set claim sum. In my set statement, I'll write my PSS_RX data set. And then the first thing I do after that by statement is make sure I write that by statement in the data step as well. Okay. Now that I've gotten to this point, let me go. Let me share a whiteboard to help you to help show how I would think through this. Can you guys see the whiteboard I'm showing? Okay, I got thumbs ups. I like that. Okay, so let's say this is the data set. We've got individual 1 in here 4 times, individual 2 in here, let's say twice. I've shown many columns here from day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, so on and so forth. And I want to basically take the 1 here, 0 here, 0 here, and let's say 1 here, right? And then maybe there is a 0 here and a 0 here. I want to take this row and I want to sum it up to basically sum it up across this bucket so that there is just one row. Sorry, I drew my bucket wrong there. So there is just one row for each Benny ID. So the first thing I have to do is I have to say, okay, I need to add 1 to 0. And then I need to take the sum of 1 and 0 and add that to 0. And then I need to take the sum of 1, 0, and 0 and add that to 1. And then for my second bucket, I need to start summing again. So I need to take 0. I need to sum that with 0. I need to remember the sum of 0 and 0 and sum that to the next row and the next row and so on and so forth. So anytime I'm summing repeatedly like that, I know I have to use the retain function, right? And when I have to use the retain function, I basically have to find a way to add up this value and store it in that variable I'm retaining. So I'm going to create a new variable here. Let's say I'm going to call it new. This new variable should have the value 1 for the first row. It should just carry this forward. For the second row, it should take 1, add 0 to it, and then bring both of those together and have the value 1 here, right? So it should remember the 1, bring that in, and then add that 0 to the value it remembered, that which is 1 plus 0, which is 1, and that should be the number. Then it should remember this number, bring it down, add the 0, and together that is 1. 1 plus 0, 1. And then it should remember the 1 down again, then add the 1 from here, and it should make it 2. Right? And then for my next row, which is a different bucket, right? I needed to just bring in 0 and not remember the value from the previous thing, right? So the way to do this is to simply make sure you define a new variable and then retain the value of this variable, but not carry forward the retaining or the summing, if you will, across my different buckets. So let me show you guys how I would do this. Where is my share screen button? Okay, so I realize that there are 210 day variables in our data set, but my thought process for solving problems like this always begins with one variable. Let's just do one variable first. If that variable works, we can worry about the remaining 210 variables afterwards, right? So let me do retain day 1 underscore sum. Actually, I'm going to call it sum underscore day 1. And then I'm going to say if the Benny is the first Benny ID, so if the bucket is just beginning, right? So our bucket, if you remember, this is our bucket, right, across 5 rows. The first row is basically the first time the Benny is happening, which can be identified using the variable first.BennyID. And that first.BennyID will be equal to 1 for this row. For the last row, the variable last.BennyID will be equal to 1. So if we use those two things as handles, we can define our buckets. So let me do this. So I will say if first.BennyID equals 1, then sum underscore day 1 should be equal simply to my day 1 variable, where day 1 variable is just called day 1. I don't have any fancy names there. But if first.BennyID is not equal to 1, which is if it is equal to 0, then sum underscore day 1 equals sum underscore day 1 plus day 1. That's it. That's all of the code I need to do to add up day one to these numbers. Now, I want to run this and I want to make sure it works. But before I do that, I'm going to write a keep statement because I don't want to look at every single column in this data set. I only care about the columns I'm interested in. I want to keep Benny ID. I want to keep the day one variable. I want to keep sum underscore day one. That's it. What are the variables do I need? Well, I want to, here, let me do this. Because first dot and last dot Benny IDs are always a challenge, let me visualize these variables and we can retain those as well. So here, instead of doing this, I can do first underscore. After I do this, I'm going to pause for a second if you have questions, because I know this part can be confusing. Log looks okay. No, log does not look okay. So here's the thing. Log did not give me any errors and warnings, but I can see that the variable is uninitialized. That should never happen. If you see that in a note, that means that the log is not throwing an error, but you probably have a typo. And I'll tell you exactly where the typo is. I missed out the ID here. I wrote Benny, and that's not right. The variable is first underscore Benny ID. Okay. Check my log one more time. Missing values were generated, which is fine. We'll talk about what that means later. For now, let's look at our output data set. Okay, so I can already tell we've got some issues. Well, the first issue is that I ran this for day one, and I think nobody had a prescription on day one, so it is really not possible for me to tell if the code worked or not. So let me just change this. Instead of this for day one, why don't we do this for like day 15? Because I know somebody had a prescription for 15 today. I could have done this for day one. I could just, nobody had a prescription on day one. How can I check if my code is working or not? So day 15, it should work. Now let's see if it works. Okay, so day 15, here's my first dot Benny ID, last dot Benny ID. Okay, so you'll see here, let's look at the first and last Benny ID variable first, right? So this individual one is in here 5 times. The first dot Benny ID variable is 1 for the first time they're in there, and it is 0 for every other time. The last underscore Benny ID variable is 1 for the last occurrence of this beneficiary in the data set, and it is 0 for all the previous occurrences. My sum underscore day 15. My sum underscore day 15 is basically the summed version of the day 15 variable. The same variable, but sum. So for Benny ID 1, they never had a prescription on day 15 on any of their 5 prescriptions. So this is missing for all 5 days, which is fine. For Benny 3, this person had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 prescriptions. Day 15 was 1. So some day 15 is 1 here, but why are these missing? This is not right. Something's not working. Let me go check my data set. Check my code, excuse me. Sum underscore day 15 plus day 15. I know what's happening. So, okay, this is actually the reason why I left this in the previous data step. I left this as missing values without writing an else statement in order to show this, and then it caught me unaware suddenly. So when you use the plus function to simply add 2 variables, the plus function does certain weird things, right? When you use the plus operator, it basically only works if you don't have any missing values in either of your variables. If you have a missing value, then the total output from that plus operator will become missing as well, right? So if you're going to use the plus operator, make sure you don't have missing values in your data set. The way to deal with that is to just use the sum operator instead. The sum operator is more smart about dealing with missing values. What that will do is that if you have a missing value, it treats it as a 0 and it does the addition anyway. So if you want to add 2 variables, be cognizant as to which operator you are using to add them. Let's see if this worked. Okay, there you go. So now it actually works. So adding variables is meaningful if you use the sum statement instead of the plus operator. Well, anyway, besides the missing value problem, let's see if the retain statement and first dot and last dot work. So for individual 1, they never had medications on day 15, right? So some day 15 variable is missing for all rows, which is fine. They didn't have any prescriptions. For individual 3, they had a prescription for day 15. They had a medication on day 15 for the first row, which is the first prescription they took, but all of the following prescriptions, they didn't have any medications on day 15. So when we use the first and last dot variables with the retain statement, what we are doing is we said for the first occurrence of this individual in the data set the sum variable to be equal to the day 15 variable. So it just said this variable equals 1. So basically copied it in here. Now, for the next row, this is what we said. We said if it is not the first.benny first.benny equals 0, which is right here, first.benny equals 0 for this individual, there we are just taking the value of sum underscore day 15 and we are adding it to the day 15 value. I hope you can see my cursor as I'm moving it back and forth because I don't have a pointer to point at things here. Unless, yeah, I don't have a pointer to point at things. But so hopefully you can see this. I'm taking where first.benny equals 0, I'm taking my sum underscore day 15 variable and I'm adding that to my day 15 variable. But remember, I'm also retaining my sum underscore day 15. So this value of 1 in the first row actually gets retained. So SAS remembers that as the value for the second row, right? And then for this row, it is taking the value of 1, which it remembered from there, and it is adding to that the value missing, which is treated as 0 because we are using the sum function, and the sum of 1 and a 0 is 1, so that's what we get there. For the next row, same thing happens. First.benny is 0, which means the value in this column, which is retained from the previous row, gets added to the value in this column, which is 1 plus 0, which is 1. Right? So we've gotten this sum underscore day 15 variable now, which is added across this bucket. So all 6 rows, all 6 prescriptions for this individual, we've summed day 15 across all 6 rows to obtain numbers. Now, if this person had a 1 here or here or here, then these numbers would increment, but because they didn't have anything, because they didn't have any overlap in their prescriptions on day 15, we are not seeing those things. But this code is working in the sense that if I have to roll up to 1 row now, which roll up at this point just means retain the last row, right? If we retain the last row, because of my retain function and my sum statements, basically, I have added up these things across the rows, which means if I retain this last row, I should have information on how many prescriptions this individual had across all of the rows, right? So I can now delete this row. I can now delete all of these rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because the information present in these 5 rows has been captured in the 6th row right here. Does that make sense? I want to pause for a second here, see if everybody's following. Queenie, do you want me to repeat anything? I'm happy to repeat.
No, I think I'm fine for now. Yeah. I think I'm
Are
fine.
you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I understand. So this is the last row. If I delete all the 5 rows preceding it, the 6th row captures all of the information in this previous 5 rows. So let me go ahead and write the code for that. There you go. So if I do this, now you'll see that my log only has 16 observations because we've now rolled up to 1 row per individual. What is that 1 row? That 1 row was the last row for every individual, right? Whenever an individual has been repeating in a data set, we are only holding on to the last occurrence. So now you'll see each Benny is only in there once. And we can identify how many prescriptions, how many medications they had on each day based on this variable, which was actually calculated from this variable, right? So this worked. So now I know that on day 15, across all of the prescriptions that individual 3 got, they had a medication on day 15. Across all of the prescriptions, not just one prescription, across all of the prescriptions, I know that beneficiary 3 had one medication that they could take on the 15th day during my 210 possession day array. So now I've done this successfully, but I've done it for one variable. I need to do it for 210 variables. But you will see that once we've written the code for how to do this for one variable, it is really easy to do it for all 210. We just need to replace every single time we mention that variable with the whole array itself. And that's it. So let me go ahead and first define my array. So I have my possession array, which has 210 arrays, 210 variables, day 1 through day 210. And then instead of my someday array, I have to now, instead of my someday variable, I have to have a someday array. So I'm going to call that array someday. And that will also have 210 rows, 210 variables, because there are 210 in the previous array, and I need to have one for each of those variables. So sum underscore day 1 to sum underscore day 210. And then instead of having this variable someday 15, I'm just going to delete the 15. So now I'm retaining every single variable in my array. All of them are getting retained when I write that. And then this piece of code where we are adding this, we just need to change that to the array name itself instead of the variable name. But when we change it from the variable name to the array name, we need to make sure that it is running for every single variable in that array, which we can accomplish using a do loop. So let me write a do loop. Do I equals 1 to 210. I'll add an end statement underneath. And now, instead of someday 15, I'm just going to say someday I. Instead of day 15, I'm just going to say day I. Is that right? Okay, I think I got it. And now in my keep statement, I'm just going to say POSS. I'm just going to replace the variable name with the array name, and we should have everything we need. Oh. Yeah, so. Okay, so this worked for the most part. The only thing it didn't work is that keep statement does not take the whole array name. Instead, I need to just do this. There you go. Someday 1 through someday 210. So now I'm just listing out my variables instead of just the array. The retain statement will take the name of the array, but I don't believe the keep statement will. And I could tell that that was the case because that was the error message here. It said the array POSS is not allowed in the keep statement. So instead I just named it. So now I have 420 in the college because there's no one to be 410. Someday 1 to someday 210. Let's go select a random date. I'm going to select day 115. I'm going to add someday 115. So look at the, wow, look at that. Something's going on there. I don't like those numbers. Oh, not bad. Since the array not called day, array is called POSS. I name my array differently from the variable name itself. And that's what the whole thing. So errors like this will happen time to time. If you check your log and check your output data and which chance to get. So let me select one here, day 85. Select someday 85 as well. Now we have only 16 rows in the data set, one for every single individual that we are interested in. And someday 85 looks like it should have all the right numbers. The day 85 variable is meaningless at this point, right? Because this day variable depends on the prescription, but the someday variable is the sum of all the prescriptions for that individual. So really, we don't need the day 85 variables at all. I'm just going to take these rows, these variables out of my keep statement because I don't need them anymore. And then my first.variad, last.variad, I don't need those either. Really, I already know how that works, and I think my code is functional. So I'm just going to run this without all of that. Okay, so that is step 5. I know it's 4:15, but I'm going to pause for another second, see if somebody has questions. Okay, not hearing anything. So I'm hopeful that you're all following so far. And step 5 is clear. Next, let's look at step 6. In step 6 is probably the most challenging step in this homework because I did not show a clear example of how to do this. I'll let you guys figure out how to do this. We are identifying the numerator, right? We need to identify number of days of continuous fills. There are a lot of different ways to do this particular step within SAS. I am going to show 2 possible opportunities, 2 possible strategies you can use to do this. But really, there are so many ways to show this. I could never show all of them to you guys. Okay, so I'm going to set my previous data set here, claim_sum. I'm going to set that. And now I need to identify how many days they took a prescription before they had a gap day. And the gap day is happening because they didn't get their next refill in time before the previous prescription ran. So first I'm going to write an array statement, sum_day, which has 210 variables. Goes from sum_day 1 to sum_day 210. Okay. There are a couple of ways to do this. Let me show you guys the first one. I'll first finish writing my code and then I will explain what the code is trying to accomplish. Before I do that, let me set a few flag variables. So I'm going to say start_count equals 0, end_count equals 0, and then count_tx equals 0. I'm going to use these 2 variables, start_count, end_count, as my flag variables, and they will tell me when to start counting and when to stop counting. And my count_tx variable will be the variable I'm interested in, which should tell me the number of days of continuous fills. So here I'm going to say if start_count equals 0 and the possession array, let me call this array POSS, easier for me to think through. If POSS equals 1, then switch that flag to start count. So I need to start counting only after the first occurrence of the POSS I equals 1 happens. And then I need to stop counting when start count is equal to 1 and POSS I equals 0. Then I'm going to flip my other flag variable, right? So this particular if then statement is saying if start count is 0, right, and then you encounter the first variable in that 210-day array, which is equal to 1, then immediately flip the start count to a 1, and we need to start counting the number of days. And once this flag has been flipped from 0 to 1, which means the individual has started their medication, their first prescription has started, at that point, if you ever encounter one variable in that array which is equal to a 0, so the first time you encounter a 0, then you flip the end count variable, and that's where we have to stop counting in order to get the number of days of continuous fills without a gap. Okay? So once we have those flags set and the flags flipped appropriately, the next part is super easy. Then I just say if start count equals 1 and end count equals 0. So as long as the therapy has started but not ended, that's what that if statement is saying, then count underscore tx equals count underscore tx plus 1. So as for each loop from 1 through 210, which is what my do I equals 1 through 210 is happening, as long as the therapy has started and therapy has not ended, as in there is no gap yet, just increment my count underscore tx variable by 1. And that's it. That should tell me everything I need. Let me run this, see if the log works. Log looks okay. Output data. This is a little hard to verify on SAS Studio because I'd have to retain every single row here, every single column to confirm if it has worked right. But I assure you that this did work correctly. The only way I can demonstrate it worked correctly is if I can show you guys every single one of these columns, and selecting every single one of these boxes is going to take us forever. So take my word for it. Well, yeah, take my word for it. This has worked. Can somebody tell me if they ran this and if they got the same numbers, or if they use the same method to run this? You guys still there?
I got stuck before this, so no confirmation.
Okay. Anybody else? Anyone else try and look at those numbers?
I think same with me. I was struck way before, so.
Okay. So I'm seeing that this is actually not correct. And I also understand why. I understand why because I said POSSI equals 0, but really in my data set, there are no zeros for my arrays. There are just missing values. So I'm going to replace my 0 with a missing value. And I only know this because I ran this in SAS before I started this video, and I remembered that the numbers look different. Let me check one more time, see if this is correct. There you go. Okay, this is correct. That is correct. So this code worked. So essentially what we are doing is we are creating a flag that indicates when therapy starts and a second flag that indicates when therapy ends. And as long as the value of I is in between, as long as we are after therapy count started but before therapy ended, we just need to increment the value of count underscore tx by 1. And that's what that code is doing. If you don't want to do it this way, I want to demonstrate a second method to do the same thing. And this method is going to be slightly different because we'll use a do until loop to do this. Here I will say do I equals 1 to 210 until POSSI equals missing and count underscore tx is greater than 0. Okay, you will see how this works in just a second. I'm going to say if POSSI is greater than 0, then count underscore tx equals count underscore tx plus 1. That's it. So instead of using all of these flag variables here, let me comment this out. By the way, if I were in SAS, I would have literally taken 5 individuals, counted manually what the correct number of count underscore tx should be, and then verified that that's what it was. I'm not able to do that right now on SAS Studio, but I would have literally counted every single row for at least 5 people to make sure my code was working okay. I have a syntax error now because I should have left a space here. I just realized another grave error I made. I never saved my code file. Every time you're working in SAS, please save your code file as often as you can. or you will lose your progress. Okay, log looks okay. Let me check my output, see if I got the same number. I did not. Okay, well, I did not get it because I used the plus operator. Again, I have missing values. I cannot be using the plus operator. I have to be using the sum operator. This is why you have to be super careful with missing values in SAS.
So can you do this by creating the disenroll flag variable, like the way you did previous week?
Well, so remember the flag, whatever you call it, whether you want to call the flag disenroll or whether you want to call the flag start therapy or end therapy, same thing, right? So the previous example I showed is with those flags. So we did the disenroll flag in the previous week's example. This is the same, this is similar to that. Instead of disenroll, I'm calling my flag start count and end count. That's it.
Okay.
And in this other scenario, in the second method, I'm showing the same thing using a do until loop, and we're getting the same exact numbers again, right? So here in the do until loop, what I'm trying to say is the loop should go from 1 to 210, but the loop should stop running as soon as we hit a missing value for possession, which means there's a gap in therapy, but that gap should happen after count underscore tx is greater than 0. Count underscore tx greater than 0 is another way of saying the therapy started or the start count flag has been flipped, right? So if possession I is greater than 0, which means therapy has started, then start counting the count underscore tx variable and start incrementing it by 1 for each loop. But then stop running the loop as soon as this condition is met. And this condition is saying therapy has started and we have a missing value in the array, which means we have a gap in the possession. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Okay.
Okay. Everyone else, does method 1 and method 2 both make sense? I understand this is a little complicated, but remember, these are using the same concepts we learned in those videos. We are just applying them to some complex examples.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's just very.
It will take some time to think through this. It's not straightforward, especially if you haven't been programming before. I think it helps if you have programmed in other languages before, but if you have not, it takes a while to come up with this programming logic. But if you understand what this code is doing here, that should help you get there quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do the next step, which is calculate the denominator, unless somebody has a question that they want to ask. Okay, so this step right now, we have the numerator from this step, right? In the next step, we need to calculate the denominator. In order to calculate the denominator, I'm actually going to use my POSS underscore RX variable, RX dataset, sorry, because in that dataset, I've got every single individual's prescriptions. We know everybody's prescriptions. We have all of their prescriptions, so we can identify their first prescription all the way to their last prescription. So to do this, I have to use my first and last dot variables one more time. I know we hate those by now, but we have to use them one more time. I'm going to create a new variable called first fill, and I'm going to retain that variable. And then I'm going to set this variable. Let me see this. Let me write the code first, and then I'll explain what this is doing. First underscore fill equals fill date. If last binary equals 1, then I'm going to say duration equals fill date plus days underscore supply minus first fill. Am I doing that right? Yep. Okay. I'm gonna add +1 here. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I basically want to, let me go back to this file. It's easier to explain this visually. At least for me, it's easy to visualize this. So, okay, so for each beneficiary across the 5 rows, I need to subtract basically, I need to identify duration of therapy, right? Duration of therapy is this last date minus this first date. But that's not enough. I need to take this last date and first date because they started prescription on this date, but they ended their therapy on this date plus 30 days, correct? So I need to take the sum of these two variables and I'll get that date, which is their last date of therapy, and then subtract that from the fill date. So in order to do that, I'm going to use my retain statement. Let me go back to my code here. I'm going to use my retain statement to create a new variable that will retain this exact value. First, this value should be retained, but it should only be equal to the first time that Benny occurs in the data set. For every other occurrence, I don't care. So I'm only retaining it. I'm retaining this variable and I'm setting it to fill date only when first.Benny ID equals 1. Right, so let me show you guys what this will look like. Before I do that, to see how this will work, I'm going to comment out this part so we'll have all of our rows in the data set and then we can talk about how this works. Okay, log looks okay. Let's check the output data. Oops, I've got 210 rows that I don't need in this data set. Let me use the keep statement so I don't have to scroll too much. Benny ID, fill date. There you go. Okay, so now you can see for this first individual, okay, this is showing as 20869, which is actually 19 February 2017. If you want to visualize that, we need to use a format statement. And I realize we are running over, so I'm going to try and keep this short. We can always revisit that later. Okay, so the first fill variable has been set to be equal to fill date only for the first occurrence of the Benny ID, right? So this is 19 February, and then because we retained it, every single row, it reads 19 February, right? So we take 19th February in that last occurrence of that individual's prescriptions, and then we just subtract 25th June plus 30 from 19th February to identify how long they were on therapy. That's what this is doing. It is taking the fill date for the last prescription, adding the day's supply, and then it is subtracting the fill date for the first prescription for that individual. And I'm adding +1 here because when you subtract these two dates like that, it doesn't count the first date of the prescription, so I have to add +1 just to make sure the number looks okay. So if I do this, I identify the duration of therapy in the last row for every single individual. So as long as I write my if statement here, and then remove every variable I don't need except Benny ID and duration, I've got exactly what I need, and that is step 7. Does that make sense? I think I went through that a little faster than I would have liked to, but I'm hoping that was clear. So for my next step, what I need to do is this duration variable is in a different data set. I want to bring them into one data set. So let me try and first merge those two data sets. I have my code written elsewhere, so I'm going to copy and paste in so that this goes a little faster. If I want to merge the data sets, I want to first sort both of them. This data set is called numerator. That data set is called duration. Copy and paste that. I think I've got some things in my chat window here that I have not checked. Okay. Queenie, can you still hear me? I just saw your comment about not being able to hear me.
Yeah, I am now.
Okay. So now I am basically going to merge my data sets, and this is the last step you need to complete. So I'm almost done here. So now I've merged the two data sets. So I'm merging the variable data set numerator with the data set duration, and I'm merging them by Benny ID. And I'm doing an inner merge here because I don't want to hold on to any variables that are, any individuals that are not in both data sets. Check my log. Log looks fine. Yeah, so now I have all these someday variables, which really I don't need those variables. So let me try and drop those. Someday 1 through someday 210. Okay, so now count underscore tx is my numerator. Duration is my denominator, which is the duration of therapy. And if I divide these two numbers, I should get my percent adherent, right? And the I variable is something I don't need, so I'm just going to drop the I variable as well. And let me go ahead and calculate my percent adherent right here within this data set, because there is no need to create a new data step just to do that. Count underscore tx divided by duration multiplied by 100. That's it. That is the last of this homework. And there's your answer. So at this point, these two individuals which didn't have any prescriptions, I can set them to 0. So I can say if percent adherent was missing, then percent adherent equals 0. Or I can delete those individuals from my data set at this stage if I wanted to, depending on what the project specific needs are, right? So either one is okay. You choose which way you want to use. Other things you can do if you want to make this look better is you can round your percentage variable up to 0.01, which is 2 decimal places, and it makes your numbers look a little more presentable. But there you go. So this person had 37% of their duration before they had the first gap in fills, if you will, and so on and so forth. That concludes our homework for this week. And I understand I rushed through that last part here. But any questions before we log off for today? Okay. I realized we've been losing people as the call went longer than it should have. But if I don't hear any questions, I'm going to say I'll call it a day. I'll upload this to YouTube because I know some people could not be here today and some people had to drop off early. And if you have more questions about this, please watch through this and work through the homework on your own. And if you have any more questions, please let me know so that we can address them next week. That's all I have. Thank you for your patience. I know we went over a little bit, so I appreciate you guys being patient and waiting as we were wrapping up. I hope you have a good weekend.
You too, Sujit. Have a good day. Bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.